The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. Today we'll be talking about culture and tradition. And since that's quite a broad topic and there are so many directions that we can go, we've invited three guests from three diverse fields to discuss it with us. Our first panelist is Eric Michael Johnson. Eric has a master's degree in evolutionary anthropology, focusing on great ape behavioral ecology. He's currently a doctoral student at the History of Science at the University of British Columbia, looking at the interplay between evolutionary biology and politics. He writes for Scientific American at his blog, The Primate Diaries, notes on science, politics, and history from a primate in the human zoo. Eric, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
And back for her second appearance on Skeptically Speaking, we have Marie-Claire Shanahan. She's an assistant professor of science education at the University of Alberta, where she researches the interactions that people have with each other in science. In addition to research, she teaches courses in science teaching methods, sociology of science, scientific language, and educational research materials. She blogs at Boundary Vision and often contributes to the Scientific American guest blog. Welcome back, Marie-Claire.
Thank you. It's great to be here again.
And anyone who listens to the show regularly knows our last guest, Greg Laden, Minnesota biological anthropologist and author of the aptly titled Greg Laden's blog. Hello, Greg.
Hi, how are you?
And this episode was actually Greg's idea, and it was a brilliant one. So thanks for that, sir.
No problem.
So maybe let's start out with a definition. What is tradition, and is it different than culture? Eric, let's start with you.
According to anthropologists and animal behaviorists, cultural tradition is anything where there's a local behavioral variation that occurs for non-genetic or non-ecological reasons, and it lasts beyond its originator.
That was very academic. Marie-Claire?
From my perspective, I would see the tradition part being a practice. And I think this goes exactly with what Eric was saying, but the specific practices and the instances in a way of culture. So what people do as a result of culture, what they say, what they think. Tradition is sort of an embodiment of elements of culture, I think.
So the non-biological part is a key for you as well?
Absolutely, yes.
All right. Greg?
Yeah, I agree with both of those. I would just add that tradition usually has a time depth component to it, and archaeologists specifically use it for things that last long periods of time.
So are there non-cultural traditions then? No. Okay. Good. That's been established. Now, Greg, the tagline of your blog is culture as science, science is culture. And you write about, honestly, everything from climate change and feminism to pygmy tribes and politics. And in some of those cases, I think what you're really talking about is the conflict that traditions can cause. So what do you see as the main sources of conflict around tradition?
If you ask the average person that, I think one of the first things people will think of is that there's large conflicts between large traditions. Because we see in our world today, there are people who have large, distinctly different religions who are fighting each other in the Middle East, that kind of thing. And so, if your traditions are sufficiently different from someone else, then you're going to have conflicts between them because of so many differences. But in reality, that actually very rarely happens. In most parts of the world where people have very different sets of traditions and cultures, they very often live side by side or are integrated in ways that are mutually productive. And in fact, there are places where cultures split and create multiple traditions. Classic example is horticulturalists, people who grow food in gardens, and hunter-gatherers who are sharing a cultural system but have distinctly different cultures. I think that the real conflicts happen when traditions are really close. The Dead Sea Scrolls and all those early religious documents are not about rabbis sitting in a cave in the Dead Sea wondering about Buddhists and Hindus. They're worried about other rabbis and what they're thinking.
Right.
And when exactly do you celebrate Christmas and open your presents is like a source of conflict. Who's making the pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving? Everything from small to large issues often come from, I think, when people are working within a tradition, trying to define their position in it and their relationship to other people in regards to that tradition.
We're talking about conflict around tradition. But tradition can also be a source of stability, right?
Well, yeah, I think that in Eric's initial definition, it can be that culture is the knowledge or information that gets passed on over time, and that can be very important information. I mean, the basic idea of how to make the stuff you use in your technology and how to grow food and all that kind of thing, the people don't reinvent the wheel. They receive the knowledge of the wheel, in a sense. So in that way, it works just on a day-to-day pragmatic basis. Also, tradition, I think, can take the heat off when it comes to decision making. I think a really good example of this is the famous story that went around last year or the year before, where there was an example of a thought experiment where you're told you're standing on a bridge next to another person, and there's 5 workers on a train track below, and somehow you know if you throw this one person you're next to on the train track, they'll be killed by the oncoming train, but it will alert the others and it will save their lives. Will you do it or not? And most people say no. What economists and psychologists say is that is a human being acting irrationally. But what is really, I think, is happening is that's a human being doing what their traditions tell them to do. You don't throw someone off of a bridge. It's our rules of existing, our rules of social interaction that cause us to not have to rethink every moral or ethical dilemma or rethink every technological problem, reinvent every wheel. In a way, is more efficient as long as the tradition we are following matches what's actually happening and what it has to match.
Well, I like the idea of the fact that there's a tradition around not throwing people off bridges, but
Right.
some traditions don't actually seem to matter much at all. And you
In
actually
some other
wrote,
culture, you might throw the person off the bridge.
Right,
Just to
right.
Find that culture.
but some actually, like you wrote a post a few days ago that mentioned a Pygmy tribe's burial practices.
Oh, yeah, this is something interesting. As an American and someone who also, by the way, was exposed to Native American archaeology long before I did any work in Africa, the knowledge I received was that burial practices, how you bury your dead, how you treat the dead, are traditions. It's a way of doing something that is not only prescribed for your culture, but also sacred, and you don't change those things. People these days in Western society who want to encourage cremation over burial, it's an uphill battle to convince people to not spend zillions of dollars on a funeral and take up this piece of landscape forever. And burial practices are very often at the core of a culture's sacred rituals and so on and so forth. So when I was going to work for the Pygmies, I of course read everything I could find on them, and accounts by missionaries, anthropologists, and others for several areas in the Ituri forest in the Congo where I was going. And many of them talked about burial. They talked about how the Pygmies bury their dead. And there's many ways to bury your dead across cultures. What was amazing is that no two accounts were the same. Everyone had a different account, even though the time period was about 100 years, and there were only a few different locations being observed by a few people in a very small area. And the burials that I observed were yet again different. There was no consistency. And when I eventually was digging archaeological sites with FA Pygmies, and actually they were helping me to excavate, and I asked them, what happens when we find a body? What will you think about that? What will your concerns be? And they didn't care. They basically, their philosophy was when you're dead, your body is useless and means nothing, and it doesn't make any difference what happens to it. And at one point, we actually found a tooth that they were convinced was a human tooth. So I was able to test the idea that they were concerned, and they weren't. It turned out it was actually a mangabey tooth, but they don't know their teeth as well. So that just showed me that you already know, anybody who's even a little bit world-wise knows that other cultures do different things. So other people bury their dead differently, other people eat different food. But what people might not realize is that the things that you typically think of as important, they're not only different in other cultures, but whether or not it's important might be different. You know, we hear in our day-to-day culture that every culture has a belief about the origins that involves a flood or something like that. Right. And there are probably cultures that don't have origin stories. Offhand, I don't know of any. But there certainly is the case that origin stories are extremely diverse and different from each other. Practices of relationship to the dead are different from different groups. How marriages are arranged. Every culture has marriage, as far as you know, but how that works is dramatically different from culture to culture. Male and female relationships can be dramatically different from culture to culture. So whether or not something is even important might not be what you expect.
We have a question from the chat from Tribal Scientist.
In your stopping a train example, is it necessarily culture, or could something more biological be acting? Or is that an unfair distinction?
Actually, I think that might be even a better answer. And until thinking about this show, I was thinking it was a different explanation, which is that we understand, even though in the experiment you're told you can throw this person off the bridge, don't worry about it. Internally, we know that if we attempt to throw another person off the bridge, they may end up throwing us off the bridge.
Interesting.
So I think that experiment is invalid. So today I'm saying it's culture. The other day I was thinking it was still culture maybe, but in a more innate sense of preservation that would cause you to not go up to some guy in a bar and punch him in the face because you don't like the way he looks unless you're really drunk.
Right. And then all bets are off.
Right.
Eric or Marie-Claire?
Sort of a little bit about this idea of trying to pull apart things that are they're cultural versus things that are sort of biological but act and look like cultural things. One of the things that seems to make a big difference on that is whether you perceive that something has changed. And I think looking at that example, all of us would imagine people 50 years ago, 100 years ago doing the same thing that we would. But to actually maybe understand whether it is cultural for us, that longer time scale would probably be required to actually understand if that's different. And if it's not, then maybe it is biological. And I find that even looking at things that should be short-term, like science education, which is what I research, is that people assume that things don't change just because it hasn't changed in the short amount of time that they've been involved. But I think that's sort of one of those things that helps us understand whether something's biological or cultural.
Eric?
Well, in terms of trying to separate what would be a cultural tradition from biology, there are certain human universals, such as motherese. All societies have this sort of baby talk that both mothers and fathers will use for their young children. And it may have something to do with the way that infants hear and respond to sounds. By using a sing-song voice, they just respond better. And so cultures around the world discover this and adopt it for interacting with their children.
We have a question from John.
What's your position on cultural relativism and the idea that the concepts of right and wrong are culture-specific?
We'll just get into the big questions right at the start of the show.
Right. This is a very interesting question because things have changed. A lot of people, I think of anthropologists who go off in the field and do work as having with them a kind of prime directive a la Star Trek, where you don't go into some culture and make changes. What most people don't realize is how little effect you actually have when you go into a culture and make changes. You've already made the changes. You made the changes as a Westerner when you were born. You know, the effects that I had on the pygmies in the interior forest are much greater because I own a cell phone than when I was there.
Right.
Because in order to make my cell phone, you have to have a war in the Congo and so on. So it's not what people often think it is. But as far as what's right and wrong, I just think there's a kind of a line that exists at any given moment between those things you just leave alone and those things that you can say shouldn't be like they are. If you go back 20 years, in an anthropology department, I attended many talks by people working in different parts of the world where they were reporting what they saw and read much literature, and not ever did anyone ever really complain about female genital mutilation. It was just something that was observed. Actually not observed usually, but simply something that was done, and they knew about, anthropologists knew about happening, and its ethics and its legitimacy as a practice, and whether or not you should be expressing an opinion on it, it was never considered, and now it is. Now I think that I don't think there's any anthropologists today who think that female genital mutilation is okay. I think we've changed that. And within our own Western culture, you can see that. I mean, it is true right now that in middle-class, educated South Africa, kids are not put in car seats because they can't be. Any South African will tell you this. At least, this may not be true now, but it was 5 or 6 years ago last time I encountered this. Kids don't stay in their car seats. So why put them in there? And to an American, I don't know about how it is in Canada, but an American, that's just considered child abuse. Our kids are always in child seats. But when I was a kid, there weren't any child seats, and we were not put in anything like that. There weren't even seat belts. So these are just simple examples, but where in practice, we can't understand why someone would think this is not wrong, yet we ourselves didn't think that just a couple decades ago. So there's a line you can draw, but where that line is moves a lot. And the fact that it moves a lot doesn't mean that it's relativistic, purely relativistic or undefined, but I think rather we're experiencing a kind of global cultural evolution where as time goes by, you can see globally people are thinking of these things. There are tribal people in the Amazon who engage in conversations with other people about female genital mutilation in Africa. People are, even in relatively isolated areas, are actually involved in these conversations with each other across the world. So, and I think that we are globally evolving culturally in a way that we can see more and more and more things as unacceptable and actually have that sense that they're unacceptable not really be a cultural imposition on someone else, but rather a negotiation and a conversation with them, increasingly so.
Well, so how can we think critically then about tradition without imposing our own culture on that? Can we avoid our own bias?
I think that the idea of looking at other cultures is actually the original reason to do that anthropologically is to examine our own biases. And we're not really avoiding biases, but what we're doing is expanding on the range of biases we can have. Boas's original idea of relativism, I think, was to ask people to step aside and say, we're going to accept what we see for what it is and not prejudge it and then learn from it. And in that sense, you see exotic behavior in your own culture and really familiar behavior in other cultures. If you just stand and look long enough, you realize that that's what's going on. And then I think that we somewhat overwhelm our biases or attempt to overwhelm our biases by just adding other people's biases and adding more information, basically.
Would you guys agree with that?
Yes, I would think so. Everyone has their own unique perspective, and the purpose of being a good anthropologist, a good primatologist, is to constantly question your own assumptions and try and understand the other perspective.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and we're talking about tradition. My guests are science education researcher Marie-Claire Shanahan, biological anthropologist Greg Laden, and primatologist Eric Michael Johnson. So maybe let's narrow this a bit. Marie-Claire, you focus on science education research specifically.
I do.
So how much of the way that we teach science is tradition?
Actually, a lot of it. In fact, I continue to be surprised at how much of it is. I don't think I realized that as a young teacher and as a beginning researcher as well. But the more I look at how science is taught and how difficult it is to change the way science is taught, I realize how much of it is tradition.
Now, is that supported tradition, evidence-based tradition, let's say?
Very good question. Some yes, some no. There are definitely traditions that are evidence-based and well-supported. In the area of science education classroom assessment, so I'm not talking about large-scale assessment, but how teachers assess what students know, a lot of those traditions have been very well-researched and are really well-supported and are well-communicated to new teachers as well. But there are a lot of things that really actually turns out are just traditions, and that they are the way they are just because that's the way they always are. That's the way everyone talks about science education, and it kind of perpetuates itself.
Now, I was thinking about this earlier. Do different cultures actually teach science differently?
Again, big questions. It actually probably is in some ways an easy question to answer, because we can go around the world and look at different classrooms and look at the way different curriculum documents are written, look at what teachers say about their students, look at what students say, and do sort of international comparisons. And there are some differences. I mean, different areas emphasize standardized testing more than others. There are certain topics that are really central in some countries and not in others. And in your interview recently with Eugenie Scott, the topic of the difference in Canadian and American science curricula and who has control over the curriculum, that actually does lead to some very significant changes. In Canada, it's very much that there's no national curriculum, but they're governed by the provincial governments, and it's one curriculum for every school in the province, regardless of whether it's a religious school or non-religious school. In most provinces, it's the same curriculum at English, at Anglophone and Francophone school systems. But in the U.S., there are a lot of differences because there's a lot more school district control, and that actually changes in some ways the way science is taught. So the answer to that is in some ways yes, but in other ways no. I mean, science education pretty much, I could take you probably to a classroom anywhere in the world, and what they're doing is going to look like something you'd recognize as science education. They all exist kind of on the same continuum, different degrees of certain elements, but it all looks like science education. The bigger question, though, is what do we mean by science? And that's where it probably becomes a lot more interesting. And this is something that actually has been a big topic in science education, especially in Canada, actually, looking at Aboriginal education contexts and what does it mean to teach science in Aboriginal communities, and especially in the Canadian North, but really all over Canada. And the question then is, what is the relationship between sort of deep ecological knowledge that comes from Aboriginal communities and what we would call science knowledge about ecology, for example. And I'm not really sort of talking about sort of surface knowledge, but really deep knowledge tradition on things like migration patterns, plant and animal interactions, and human-animal interactions. And if you think that that's not science, then in those schools and in any culture, then science education looks like science education.
So really, this is based on what the traditional understanding of what science is.
And what knowledge is, to be honest. So if we're thinking about the things that, and I'm speaking my experiences in a Canadian context in this, but talking about, again, ecological knowledge, for example, about migration, caribou migration. So within communities outside of school, that knowledge is developed through, intense observation, long times in the field, working with experienced elders. It is taught in a totally different way than we would think of how to teach basic ecology, which in a lot of Canada is part of the grade 10 curriculum, and we teach about producers and consumers and energy pyramids and all those kinds of things. But the way that knowledge is about the same topic, it's really physical knowledge about the world, but it's conceived of in such a different way that really is taught very differently.
Well, you know what else is traditional? The way that we all think that we know just what has to be done to make science education better. That seems to be a tradition. So why do people keep saying things like teach the concepts, not the facts? Why do people keep telling you that exactly?
Yes. I think as a young teacher, I thought those things were new ideas. I think I learned that in my B.Ed classes and thought, yeah, that is a great idea. Teach about the processes. Yes. And I do think it's a great idea. Don't get me wrong about that. But I've only really in the last couple of years realized how long people have been saying the same thing. And in that case, it's been people trying to fight for the same sort of values in science education and not seeing a lot of change. The other side of that is exactly the kind of things that you mentioned, which is sort of lots of other people having all of the solutions. And there's kind of these narratives that float through science education and looking back even to sort of early nature study education, there's evidence of these sort of narratives that are told, that come from the media sometimes, that come from parents and politicians and come from lobbying. And science education has been political for a lot longer than we would think too. It's not just about evolution in the schools. It's been including science at all in the curriculum was a political decision. And so there's been these competing narratives about are teachers qualified? So kind of a struggle for power between university scientists really. And at the time, young, usually female teachers teaching in rural communities who were seen to be have very little education, very little experience, and very little ability to create a good science education. But this idea of teacher competence is sort of started from that, but it's a myth that we keep telling ourselves that comes up every time there are elections that involve education issues, that come up every time there's questions about improving science education. Well, the teachers can't do that. They don't know enough about science. And most of the time, the people saying those things haven't stopped to actually look and see what teachers know. There was actually an editorial in the Globe and Mail earlier this year talking about how the new science teacher is predominantly female, educated in the social sciences, and doesn't know the difference between a wrench and a hammer or something.
Oh, lovely.
But the idea was basically implying that current teachers are not providing good science education because they don't have good science education. Well, it only takes a second to go look at the information actually from Canada's contributions to international tests like TIMSS and PISA to take a look at the fact that even at 8th grade, where most students are actually in general schools, so they have teachers who teach them every subject or teach them 2 or 3 subjects, even at that level, 50% of Canadian students have teachers with science degrees. And that's not even counting, senior physics courses where predominantly all of the teachers have strong science backgrounds in their subject areas. There are things that teachers do not necessarily have as much background for. One of the big ones that comes up often is climate change, and that's because that's not necessarily a part of a lot of science degrees.
Right.
But to say they don't have degrees in science is a myth. They do. That most of them do, and it doesn't take a long time to check that, and it's a shame that that's the kind of myth that gets tradition, in a sense, to complain about teachers' qualifications. It's been going on for about 100 years, more than 100 years.
Is this a problem mainly for science teachers, or is this professors in other fields?
I would say I was reminded of a program that Carl Sagan talked about when he first started his science education, where they did the program where they incorporated humanities as well. So when he had his physics lecture, the professor began talking about the Ptolemaic universe as if that was real. And by doing so, it introduced the history, the context, the culture of the time that these ideas came out of. It made the development of more modern physics much more exciting to understand what it had grown out of. And so by teaching science as a humanity rather than as our tradition typically does, as a science as science practice. So you take a biology class and everyone, sits at the lab and you dissect a frog. But teaching it as a humanity, as something that even if you're not going to become a scientist, it's information and content that is valuable for your life.
Greg?
Well, yeah, that I think is a very interesting, and that is a really good way to teach evolutionary sciences, because it isn't just boring background that always is there in the first chapter of every book, but it actually does bring alive the idea of, the discovery of science isn't just discovering a cure for cancer or discovering some new molecule. It's discovering that life is based on something fundamentally different than it was previously thought it was based on at several stages, and that the Earth is fundamentally different in age and fundamentally different in structure, and that this has been discovered over centuries. What I wanted to add, though, was one of the things, my wife is a teacher, and as I look around the house, she gets gifts from students and so on, and about every third gift has the Henry Adams quote on it: a teacher affects eternity. She can never tell where her influence stops, or the original quote, he can never tell where his influence stops. And that's a quote which is put on things to give teachers because it makes a teacher feel really good, like you affect eternity. But if you actually read Henry Adams' original essay, what he says is, we have no clue what we're doing. My colleagues are idiots. I'm an idiot, and we're completely ruining it for everybody. And this is bad because what we do affects eternity. We can never tell where influence stops, and that's a problem. And it's just interesting to me that even where we have a very clear and very readable and engaging essay by a teacher talking about how the problem with Adams was he was hired at Harvard, and Harvard basically hired its own, and it hired people based upon your parentage and not your qualifications. It did that for a long time. And he thought this was a problem, and he was trying to help to make a stop, and these are college teachers he's talking about. But even that very interesting and engaging and important missive that we should all be listening to was converted into an embroidered pillow. And it's just interesting because that's not anything close to what was originally being said.
I'm not going to ever be able to forget that. We have a question from the chat from Cy Curious.
Science education success right now relies heavily on kids who are just good at rote memorization, and this itself informs the culture of science as it is currently understood. How do you think, or do you think, that science as a culture would change if the kind of students who end up pursuing science changed? Would it change the culture of long hours and studious types?
I think it would change, but I don't think who the students are can change unless the culture of science changes. That culture of who does science is established early. Like I've actually been working the last year with a classroom of grade 5 and 6 students, so 11 and 12-year-olds. And that's already what they think science is. Is it somebody who sits alone in their lab and memorizes things and knows all the right answers? And there's this really definitive culture that is recreated in classrooms from a really young age. And there's, in a sense, no way to change that without actually changing science first. So I completely can see how if those people were different as they moved through high school and university, and when they were the different graduate students and they were then the different professors and lab directors and PIs, if they were different, they would establish a different culture, but there's no way they could be different unless the culture had already changed.
There are traditions between the United States or Canada and Japan in terms of science education, particularly in terms of primatology, where the primatologists in the West, such as Jane Goodall or Diane Fossey, will go out as lone explorers into the rainforest and collecting the data in their notepads, whereas in Japan, the tradition is to go out as a group, and each individual will be collecting different information, and it will be partially overlapping. And in that sense, you get a much different approach of looking at all of these bits of data that you're trying to collect from primate behavior. And in terms of math education, it's very much the same, where they will present a problem on the board, and a group of students have to collectively solve the problem rather than everyone individually writing in their notepad.
Interesting. Is that based on the culture then? Or does the culture come out of the education?
I believe that is a circular question.
Yes,
Hard
it
to
is.
know where it begins.
I was hoping someone could tell me chicken or egg. And we'll be right back with more on tradition after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, guest host Rochelle Saunders speaks to theoretical astrophysicist Dr. Ethan Siegel about the experiment that may have discovered neutrinos that break Einstein's universal speed limit and the implications for physics if it turns out they're right. And we're joined by neurologist Dr. Bradley Wojtek to talk about the purpose and function of the peer review process. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, on your local radio station, or online at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. Today's episode is all about tradition from the perspectives of people in three, I would say, very different fields. My guests are primatologist Eric Michael Johnson, science education researcher Marie-Claire Shanahan, and biological anthropologist Greg Laden. Now, we've been talking solely about human tradition at this point, but Eric, you do not study humans, you study primates. And do they have a tradition?
They do indeed. Let's talk sweet potatoes. Back in the 1950s is one of the earliest discoveries of cultural traditions in non-human primates. And it was Japanese macaques. And there was a 1.5-year-old macaque named Emo. And one of the ways the Japanese primatologists would study these macaques is lay sweet potatoes out on the beach. And they would often get covered in sand. Well, Emo had the bright idea to wash the potato in the water first. And this was just a brand new idea. No one else had done this before. Others began adopting this same cultural tradition. Other populations did not do this. It was just a random choice to begin doing this. Others began copying the behavior. Start off with the Emo's mother. The females were the ones that adopted the behavior first. The older males were the last. And this began the study of cultural traditions in non-human primates. And there's now a thriving field in this area.
How do we tease apart what we would consider tradition and what we would call evolution? The definition that you all decided on at the start was non-biological. So this sort of would fall into that category, but I think this is also evolution to a certain extent, isn't it?
There's certainly you're going to be adapting to different environments. Mm-hmm. But the key difference between what would be biological and what would be a cultural trait was that it would have to be practiced by multiple individuals in the community. It would need to vary between societies. And that there has to be the same potential for that behavior in other societies. So that, for example, some chimpanzee societies, when they're grooming each other, which is a very important part of chimpanzee society, it's what they typically spend most of their day doing, is sitting in groups and picking parasites out of each other's hair. And some groups will do this by holding one arm upwards. First, just some inexplicable reason, they'll hold one arm up and the others will groom them. Other societies won't do this, even though they have the potential to do so. Some societies, when they pick the parasites off, they will place it inside a leaf and wrap it up before eating it. Other societies won't do this. There are societies that open nuts in a particular way. And another society, even though they have the same nuts and the same rocks to open them with, they don't eat those nuts. So these are just examples of how there is a behavioral choice that is possible in many different societies that some choose to adopt and others don't.
But why?
A great answer for that is Fiddler on the Roof.
Oh, I knew someone was going to bring up Fiddler on the Roof during this show.
The family patriarch Tevye, he has that great line where he says, Here in Anatefka, we have traditions for everything: how to eat, how to sleep, how to wear clothes, and we always wear a prayer shawl. And then he asks, you may ask, how did this tradition start? I'll tell you. I don't know. It's just a tradition. You just do it. Everyone else does it.
What worries me, or at least what sort of makes me vaguely nervous, is something that makes me nervous also about evolutionary psychology. And a lot of people have put a lot of time into what often appears to be sort of post hoc rationalization for things like why many women like to shop, let's say, or why the sciences don't attract as many women. And of course, there could be evopsych reasons, but it could just be tradition, could it not?
It's probably worth mentioning that there's another possible answer there. And because, in other words, the term evolutionary psychology actually refers to a subset of ideas about how humans act and what the evolutionary framework for human behavior is. And it's a fairly specific and, at the moment, very popular and widely practiced way of looking at things that a lot of other people like me, I think maybe also Eric, don't subscribe to. It's quite possible that human behavior is shaped by its evolutionary history, but not through the mechanisms that are prescribed by evolutionary psychologists. The thing that's evolving here with macaques and yams or rice and the other things that they do is not that behavior. It's, if there's anything evolving at all, it's their capacity to observe and to replicate behavior, and
Gotcha.
It's their brains. And the thing is, you have to look at the fact that mammals all started out as little short-lived furry things that probably ate dinosaur eggs or something. In mammals, every female is born with, I think it's true in every mammal species, or at least placental mammals, is born with all their eggs already made. And the reason for that is because mammals only live a few days or a few weeks. Well, of course, that was in the beginning, and subsequently mammals have ended up with long lifespans, some mammals, and we're stuck with this phylogenetic background effect that females are born with all their eggs already. And it made sense when you're only going to exist for a few weeks, and now it doesn't make any sense at all for many mammals, and we're kind of stuck with it. Probably true with our behavior. We probably are not good at passing on. Natural selection can't really shape mammal behavior like it can fruit fly behavior. Fruit flies have genes that have alleles that determine whether they're foragers of one kind or foragers of another kind when they're larvae sitting in some kind of soup. Their behaviors are determined very directly by their genes. Mammals are bad at that, but instead we have these brains. And it's a bad idea. It's bad design because the brains are expensive, delicate, hard to manage. But it's the only way we can get complex behaviors is by having a brain with those capacities. So other than tuning and fine-tuning drives and general proclivities in our brains, we can't do much evolutionarily. And so if you have selection, one big idea could be if you have selection for a larger brain for any reason, you're going to get this large brain, which is a big problem. As Kurt Vonnegut said again and again in his novel Galapagos, thanks, big brain, you gave us nuclear war and all stuff. It ends up being a brain that can do stuff that really isn't under selection, and it isn't really the reason why the brain is large to begin with. As Terry Deacon, who's a brain guy, always said, if what you have is a symbolic brain, you'll treat everything like a symbol. And that symbolic brain might be there for some really good reasons, but once it's there, it's going to do all kinds of other stuff. And that then might be under kind of cultural selection, but it's not necessarily under genetic selection, and it could be even detrimental to a group or society or individual. In fact, that's obviously true in many cases.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Bryn B. for Eric from the chat.
It seems that there are a number of human traditions that are not helpful to advancing the interest of the continuation of the species. An example is drug use. Has this been observed in other animals?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Elephants, for example, will go around to certain trees that have dropped fruit on the ground, and it's been fermenting in the hot sun. They'll eat this, they'll get raucously drunk. They apparently, from behavioral interpretations, are having a good time. They have selectively chosen to go to this spot to eat these fermented apples. They're making a choice to get hammered.
They're just like us. That's lovely. Besides just getting smashed, are there other examples of animals having traditions that are so obviously detrimental?
It's very easy to reproduce that in a lab, and that's actually the foundation of a lot of psychological research, where you stick a probe inside a rat's brain and you get it to press a lever until it dies of exhaustion. And that's obviously not what you're talking about, but it's the underlying mechanism that you can get with something like addiction or some other detrimental behavior. So it's easy enough to make it happen in a laboratory setting. Anything with enough flexibility and diversity in its existing behavior, could end up with that kind of thing happening. It is really common for us when thinking about animals compared to humans, to think about humans as being very complex, very smart, very diverse in our behaviors, and to assume that a given species of mammals, everybody in that species acts the same way. The truth is that the extensive behavioral studies that you would need to do on other animals to find out what their range of behaviors are has been done on domestic mammals
Right.
and on some primates and not much else. And the total amount of time that has been spent in observing chimpanzees in the wild, for example, is roughly the same order of magnitude as a single semester of master's students doing psychology research at a large university in terms of observational hours.
Yeah, I think that was probably accurate. And in terms of what scientists' assumptions are of what is natural behavior versus what is cultural behavior, Robert Sapolsky is a wonderful example from his field study looking at baboons. And there happened to be this natural experiment in which all of the most aggressive males in this baboon troop suddenly died because they were eating at a contaminated dump site near a safari lodge. And what happened is it transformed this troop's culture. Because they didn't have these highly aggressive males, the younger males were grooming females more often. They were even grooming other males, which, as Sapolsky writes, is about as unheard of as baboons sprouting wings. And this tradition persisted for many generations. As new males migrated into this troop, they adopted the behavioral norms of that society because it worked. They were able to have the reproductive success, whatever desires that baboons have, they were able to fulfill these adopting the cultural traditions of that particular troop. And it continues to this day.
And that's, I think, what I find so interesting, because that, at least, is useful. But not all human traditions are useful. And actually, Greg, I sent you an article, a Jared Diamond article, about primitive technologies. Maybe you could just tell us about that.
This is a very, very broad brush statement. If you look at different continents or different regions where humans live, if you get a large region like Eurasia or Africa or the New World, those are places where you've had, for instance, agriculture has been developed. In fact, agriculture has been invented by human groups during the last 10,000 years or so, dozens and dozens of times. People who took their schooling way earlier will think of agriculture having been invented in the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico and in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. But we now know that a dozen major crops were domesticated in Africa, a couple dozen in Asia, and basically the number of crops that are domesticated is more or less a function of how big the area is. It's just, in other words, humans were just domesticating stuff all over the place, except in Australia. Really, Australians were always hunter-gatherers and never really domesticated anything at all. And one reason, of course, is because there's no animals there that are domesticatable, apparently, but not even any crops were domesticated. And if you go to Tasmania, which is isolated from Australia about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago at the least, there's even less technologically going on there. It was once said, and this is not necessarily accurate, but it's kind of clever, the total material culture of the Tasmanians at the time that they were run into first by English sailors, and the total number of different tools they had was less than the number of parts in the captain's service pistol in one little teeny piece of English material culture. So the idea here is these things can be invented, like the macaques coming up with the cleaning of the sweet potatoes, and then they could even spread from group to group over time, but they're also going to disappear over time. As Eric pointed out, these traditions come and they also go. You can imagine a group of chimpanzees that has 5 or 6 interesting traditions, losing all of them possibly. And if there are traditions that require more information, they might have to be passed on over time. They might have to be passed on between groups. So in other words, you need to have a critical mass. It's like, imagine if libraries always were losing books, but they could always borrow books from other libraries. If their loss rate was high enough and you had too few libraries, you'd end up with libraries each having maybe 1 or 2 books. But if you have enough libraries, they would maintain a larger collection of different titles. And Tasmania was too small of a space to maintain a very complex material culture, even to the extent that survival in Tasmania in the 17th century, 18th century required using boats, but they didn't have boats that would stay afloat for more than maybe half an hour. Other people in the world in the same region even were seafarers and could go great distances. Australia is bigger, but still not big enough to have maintained complex cultural systems. Australian culture an Aboriginal culture is plenty complex. We're talking about technology only. And in fact, Australian culture, non-technological culture, is extremely complex, linguistically complex. Groups of Australians who would use languages as trade items, inventing new ones, that kind of thing, really amazing stuff. But technologically, not large enough and not enough people in the landscape to maintain a technological complexity. And when you get to Africa, Asia, Eurasia, North America, that size continent, there's enough of a population. Having said this, I want to quickly add, one of the factors here is climate change, probably, and major changes in climate causing, there's enough room in Australia to have lots of people, but when you have a major climate change and almost everybody dies off, then you're losing all those traditions, and only this few groups that are left behind, only their traditions are going to be inculcated into the next generations, and then, of course, what's invented new. So there's a minimum size population and maybe diversity of population that you need in order to have constant invention overwhelming constant loss of invention.
There's a parallel with chimpanzee traditions in that the more females there are in a given troop, the higher the likelihood of unique cultural traits. And this is because females are the ones that migrate out of the society they're born into. And so they're going to grow up with certain behavioral traditions and carry those traditions with them to the next troop and teach them to their sons and daughters, and they will spread throughout the troop. So those societies that have the largest number of females have the largest number of unique behavioral traditions.
Marie-Claire, are there any parallels in science education?
One of the things I think about looking at historical science education materials is how difficult change is and how we constantly see this sprouting up of reform movements. And it really happened even, again, as far back as the original nature study educators. It would pop up in a city and then sort of fizzle out, and it'd pop out in another city and fizzle out. And we kind of see the same thing, like the same ideas constantly coming up and then falling aside, because when we're talking about classrooms, change and new traditions happen very much in isolation. Teachers in their classrooms. And there isn't a lot of opportunity for sort of collective change and large-scale change, lots of teachers, because it's in many ways, such an individualized activity. And I wonder if there's actually a parallel there, that there's always that loss, and that because of the nature of education, even now, we're not sort of individual teachers in one-room schoolhouses spread across the prairie anymore, but still it's so isolated that it can't actually be a critical mass, perhaps for very specific new traditions to be able to last long enough to have sustained change. I wonder if there is actually something I'd like to explore more.
And this is interesting because before I started researching for this panel, I was hoping that some tradition, at least, would be based on usefulness or evidence, trying to figure out why exactly some traditions are adopted and maintained and why some disappear. But I think what you guys are telling me is we have no idea.
Like, we assume in evolutionary studies that an allele of a gene that caused sterility would not be passed on at a high frequency, so you just assume that they would be selected against. Traditions that are highly self-destructive might be selected against in some way. But it is true. I mean, I observed something really interesting in the Ituri forest where we were hanging around in this remote village, and somebody decided, let's have some coffee, and they grow coffee in their villages there. So somebody got some coffee, about 20 beans, and the idea was to grind these coffee beans, and they brought them to this place, and they have a medicine grinder, a mortar and pestle, and someone was trying to use that to grind them up, and it wasn't working very well. This was all being done by men. If there were any women involved, they would have just, fixed it. Some men who were visiting from a nearby group, who was a linguistically different group of people who were traders in this area, the guy just said, oh, I can show you how to do it. And there's a hard clay surface, and he just took an old beer bottle, like a 50-year-old antique beer bottle that had been being used by a chair by little pygmies. And he took the bottle and ran it back and forth over the beans. If your coffee grinder ever breaks, just put your coffee on the floor and, run a beer bottle over it, and it'll turn it into ground coffee. And it was amazing. So we made the coffee, and the people left. And I said to my colleague, my informant that I had known for a few years by this point, I said, that's a great new way of grinding coffee. He said, no, it's not. I said, well, it worked. And he says, it's a voodoo thing. We don't do that. These are people that are kind of disdained. They're seen as they're traders, and you kind of have to deal with them, but nobody likes them in this particular culture. And it's the fact that it was their idea meant that you just would be also a disdainful person if you accepted it. So that was an example of a really good technological tradition, a very simple one, being offered for people's use. And you could even do it without anyone knowing you were doing it. And maybe it will even be used eventually. But the immediate reaction was, that's something they do. It's not something we do.
And that in itself is worth talking about, the fact that tradition doesn't just define what we do, it defines what we don't do. And it defines what's taboo.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me give you an opposite example, just so we don't think tradition is completely ridiculous. It was, I believe, the Inca who, in conquering increasingly larger and larger territory in South America, ran into the Quiche people. There's different ways to pronounce that depending on what part of the region you're from. These are people, Amazonian horticulturalists, who have a language that has some really interesting features to it. In any language, when you're saying something to someone, you can indicate the certainty with which you're saying it. You can say, I'm pretty sure this is true, or you can say, I'm absolutely certain of this. You know, you can do that, right? But in this language, which is now the most widely spoken language in South America other than Spanish or Portuguese, there's a marker. It's like we have past tense and future tense markers, or we have pluralization markers. There's a marker that you add to your sentence that indicates your level of certainty as to what you're saying. Scientists should just adopt this language, and it should be the language of science. Okay? And the Inca recognized many features of this language and just said, this language is much cooler than our language. We will now make this the official language. And being the kind of society where you can make everybody do whatever you want them to do if the emperor says so or whatever, they actually adopted a language of a conquered people because it was superior to their own language. So
Okay,
that's an
so
example
that's good.
of thoughtful tradition making.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we have a question from the chat, from Cy Curious.
What about traditions associated with the dividing of land among children? Is that presumably positive and based on success rates and what people knew of economics?
There's a lot of research on that. A lot of behavioral biologists have researched that in human populations because different cultures have different ways of dividing land. And that partly has to do with the way that the land is to begin with. For example, in the Tibetan highlands, you can't divide land. All the land that can be used is currently in use, and it can't be divided up because it can't be made into smaller pieces and still function. The history of American settlement in the Midwest is a matter of the land having been divided up too much in the East is a big factor to make people want to move out west. When you divide your land up in New England, you put stone fences between, forget about industrial farming later. You can't do it with stone fences everywhere. So it actually absolutely determines even the marriage systems and the cultural systems of different societies to a very large extent. It's maybe the single most important factor. But why you do it a certain way is something that is received. The fact that the Tibetan Highlanders do it a certain way, makes sense, but no one else makes sense necessarily. The way that wealth and land was divided among Portuguese was kind of quirky and weird, and they did it in the 17th and 16th centuries. The way they did it because of some historical accident, but it's the reason that Portugal has colonies in Macau.
There's another great example with hunter-gatherer residence patterns and what this often leads to in terms of behavioral traditions within the society, especially in regards to gender equality or inequality. So those hunter-gatherer societies that are matrilocal, where the females stay in the village they're born into, these societies, on average, tend to be more egalitarian, and they tend to be more cooperative because the females will come into one another's aid. They're all sisters, aunts, mother-daughter. They know each other, they help each other out and defend one another against males who may try to take advantage. Those societies that are patrilocal, where the males stay in the society, tend to have great inequality. They tend to have what you would often expect with males running things. One of the interesting features of the last 10,000 years, according to primatologist Sarah Bleffer-Hardy, is that there has been a transition from matrilocal societies to more patrilocal societies with the adoption of agriculture. Perhaps just within the last 10,000 years, we've seen a major transition that has reshaped the way that human societies are interacting based on gender.
I guess really the big question is, why does all this matter? I mean, I love this conversation. This is fantastic. This is exactly what I wanted. But why is it important to have this conversation?
Education is in many ways about passing on traditions. And so critically thinking about what they are, whether they're the traditions we want, and really thinking about how things that we might not think are tradition often really are. I'm thinking of an example. You mentioned the idea of women in science and how people research and think about why women are underrepresented in some areas of science. And if we look back, though, in the earliest history of science education, science was actually more prevalent in schools for girls because it was considered a practical activity. It was challenging, academically challenging, but it was practical and something they could use in their lives as women, whereas boys were expected to only study the elite subjects, which at the time were Latin and Greek and classical history. And those were considered kind of inappropriate for girls. That's completely different than what we would say now, and it changed for a lot of economic reasons in the sort of early to mid 20th century. That started to change. But even the question of women in science is, in a sense, there is a tradition there, thinking that it's perhaps not something for girls or that girls aren't interested in or they're not good at, is a tradition. And so I think having this conversation is a way of helping ourselves ask that question and ask, are the things that we think we know, are they really as true as we think they are? I really like Greg's suggestion of modifying our sentences so we could indicate that, because it's really easy to think traditions just are true because they're true, because that's the way it's always been. And conversations like this are the first step of actually questioning that and being able to do a better job of thinking about traditions maybe that we do want to keep and those that we really, really can change.
Well put. Eric?
I often think how our interactions ever since 2001 would be different towards the Islamic world if people saw as many sitcoms with families from the Middle East as they see families from, their own society. How much are our aggressive tendencies because of the unknown? So I think the more we understand that cultural traditions are many times completely arbitrary, and other times they have a legitimate historical explanation, and you can understand where people are coming from. I think that's really important as we are struggling to try and figure out how to live with 6, 7, 8 billion people.
Oh, that's good, sir. Greg?
Yeah, it's a hard one to top. Obviously, we talk about traditions this time of year because it's just what we've always done. I mean, this is the time of year you talk about traditions. I don't know why we have to explain it. But seriously, I think that I agree with both my colleagues said, and I think that this goes back to this global evolution of culture bit, I think. Even if there are cultures, and I think you can take a lot of cultures and show how internally they're kind of dumb, they're not well designed, there's a lot of traditions that have been added in that are not applicable anymore or that don't really work, or why do they do this? And then there's simply bad things like misogyny and violence and whatever built into a culture here and there. And you can take any culture and sort of say why it should be modified, but most of the time a relatively unwesternized, unmodified culture in many cases is going to be better than the one that you get when Western culture comes in and runs over it and wrecks it. I study hunter-gatherers, and many of my colleagues who study hunter-gatherers over the last 20 years have been studying hunter-gatherers who were ruined by Western society. Everybody is an alcoholic, everybody has diabetes, everybody dies when they're before they're 30 because they're living on a kind of reservation and everything's just really bad. I think there's many times when a traditional culture, when it gets messed up, is much, much worse than the original traditional culture was. So you're almost better off letting things be kind of half dumb and half baked than trying to fix things. But on the other hand, globally, we are improving or we could be improving. We could be saying things like female genital mutilation is always universally bad. We could be addressing at the universal level, patriarchy and distribution of food distribution systems and things like that. And what we do actually is we have power brokers that kind of support these ideas in theory, but something like the UN never actually has any power, and we never really do these things. But we are slowly evolving a culture in which, I just like to think about the fact that I'm sure that things are pretty nasty in some of the Occupy movements, but all of the stories that I've seen of the violence in the Occupy movements in the U.S. and Canada that have happened in the last several months together, I have seen that in one day.
Right.
Okay. If you go back a couple decades to some anti-war demonstrations, and we are in a society now, in a world now, in Europe and the United States, and a lot of cities around the world, where the idea of cracking down on your dissidents by macing them all or even just shooting them all just isn't done anymore because of Tiananmen Square and because of a few other things, because of Kent State. And these things are global cultural evolutions that I think are positive. And I think that having this conversation is to help underscore that and to remind ourselves that we have to be looking for what the mechanism there is for global level improvement in our culture so that we can tweak it and maybe even just make it happen more often.
I like that. Everyone, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
You can find links to Greg Laden, Eric Michael Johnson, and Marie-Claire Shanahan at skepticallyspeaking.com. And since you're there, you might as well click the links to our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, and to iTunes, where you can subscribe to the show, listen to past episodes, or write a review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Skeptically Speaking is produced with the support of CJSR 88.5 FM in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Our studio assistants are Brent Kelly and Rochelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our studio technician and research assistant. The show is produced and edited by K.O. Myers. Our theme song was written and recorded by A.O.K. And I'm your host, Desiree Shell.